Hey everyone, guess what? The CPU market suddenly looking interesting again. AMD's Ryzen launch has revitalized what has been a pretty uninteresting area of PC technology for several years now. I mean, after all, want a good budget CPU? Get an i3. Want to run most games at 60 FPS? Get an i5. Want to ensure tip-top performance in all areas? Get an i7. Want to push gaming beyond that though? Go for an Intel enthusiast chip. AMD just hasn't been on the roadmap until now, and this has had a profound effect on Intel's new Skylake-X and Kaby-Lake-X products. Pushing back against Ryzen, Intel may well have rushed a new line of CPUs to the market before they were kind of properly cooked. The results, obviously still impressive, but certainly not quite as bulletproof as I would have liked. So I'm going to be testing the 6-core i7-7800X, the 8-core i7-7820X, and the daddy of them all, the monstrous 10-core i9-7900X. Oh, and kind of more as a reference point than anything else, let's toss in the quad-core 7740X, quite possibly the most bizarre Intel CPU launch of all time. I'm using an MSI Gaming M7 ACK board here using the X299 chipset, 4 sticks of Corsair DDR4 at 3200 MHz, and calling it all a Corsair H110i GT closed-loop thermal solution. I'm most interested in gaming performance, of course, but let's kick off by checking out some benchmarks to get a kind of lie of the land of the performance differentials for non-gaming stuff. Let's begin with the standard Cinebench R15 tests. No real surprises here. Single-thread performance is mostly the same on the many core products, while the 7740X is faster. It's worth noting that mine ran at 4.5 GHz on all cores, even though I disabled MSI's enhanced turbo. Multi-core stats are where the differentials kick in, and obviously the more cores you have, the better the scaling. Frequency differentials skew the results somewhat, but I tested all processors at 4.4 GHz. The boost you got from having 10 cores versus 4 was an example of perfect scaling, but this is a synthetic bench, let's not forget. The handbrake results are tested using the 4K encoding profiles we use to produce videos for our download site, digitalfoundry.net. We use both H.264 and HEVC to encode this Rise of the Tomb Raider 4K comparison video, which you can download yourself from our site. It requires an 8-core Intel chip to encode H.264 half real-time, while HEVC, which is pretty heavy on AVX instruction usage, is far slower but achieves the same quality with around half the bandwidth. Scaling on both encodes is nothing like as impressive as Cinebench, but if we equalize all chips to run at 4.4 GHz again, things do look a bit better. Thing is though, we are already starting to look at diminishing returns in real-life productivity scenarios, and it's safe to say that the situation is even more pronounced in gaming. Ah yes, gaming. So here's the thing, you can kind of divide game engines into two camps. Those that favour many-core rendering like Crysis 3 here, and those that prefer brute force frequency. Now, those IPC monsters still actually utilize 8 threads or more, but titles like Far Cry Primal will just get much better results from a quad-core i7 than from any 6, 8 or 10-core chip. So let's run our 3 Skylake-X chips at stock frequencies up against the Kaby-Lake-X 7740X quad. Same RAM here, same OS install, it's all about the cores and the frequencies then. As always, for CPU testing, we run the titles with an overclocked Titan X Pascal running at 1080p on max settings or close to it. So the idea here is, of course, that the full-fat experience is rendered at today's most popular gaming resolution at full fidelity, but with enough GPU horsepower to ensure that CPU power and memory bandwidth are actually at the forefront of the tests. So, Assassin's Creed Unity, definitely many-core aware, but performance is basically the same whether you're on 4, 6, 8 or 10 cores. The same with The Division really, yes, some minor variation perhaps, but nothing that's going to redefine the gameplay experience. Far Cry Primal really does highlight how that particular engine is tuned for single-thread performance. Core 2 here gets maxed out on all CPUs, resulting in this, a massive 21-point lead for the 7740X over its nearest competitor. And yes, that is the cheapest processor out of the bunch, But the tables turn here in Crysis 3, where 6 cores takes a 13 frames per second lead over 4, rising to 18 frames per second with 8 cores and 29 frames per second with 10. Look, if you're intent on seeking out one single game on which to base a long-lasting CPU purchasing decision, this game and this level really are a killer workout. Factor in an overclocked i5 7600K at 4.8 GHz and you can see why this is my go-to game for CPU performance. It remains a monstrous workout for any processor. But yeah, there are others too that exhibit a distinct multi-core advantage. Rise of the Tomb Raider, for example, there's a pitched battle here between the 7900X and the 7820X, but clearly they are a touch faster than the 6-core 7800X, and in turn that commands a 10 frames per second lead over the quad 7740X. You can also see some curious groupings on the Ashes of the Singularity CPU benchmark. 7900X and 7820X push ahead, while the 7800X and the 7740X are essentially like for like. In a CPU-heavy bench like this, it's fascinating to see per-core frequency from the quad-core chip essentially make up for the lack of 2 cores versus the 7800X. And it's actually the same with the Witcher 3, the 8 and 10 core chips inch ahead, while the 4 and 6 core chips essentially like for like. Yeah, but funny thing about the Witcher 3 though, you'll note some obvious stutter at this point. Now, in this particular benchmark run, it's worse on the 7740X, but I've actually noticed plenty of stutter on this title on all of the processors on this platform. On a clean install no less, the 7740X gets the worst of it on this particular run, but the same issue manifests randomly on all of the chips I tested on the X299 platform. And for gaming performance, I do feel that the platform has some issues that need ironing out. For example, check this out. It's an alternative bench I ran on AC Unity. This time, you'll note plenty of stutter you didn't see before on the 7820X or the 7900X. The difference is that I'm using Intel's Turbo Boost 3.0 technology here, which attempts to boost throughput by shifting tasks to the 2 most performant cores in the chip. For the most part, does very little to gaming benchmarks, but in this title, having it active produces the stutter you're seeing here, while turning it off removes it completely. It's only a feature on chips with 8 cores or more, and while it may be better overall for kind of non-gaming tasks, I don't really trust it for gaming at all. So yeah, there's actually been a lot of discussion about Skylake-X seeing a degradation in gaming performance compared to its predecessor, Broadwell-E. There's definitely something different about this platform, so I overclocked the 8-core 7820X to 4.4 GHz and stacked it up against similar tests on prior 8-core Intel chips. First up, the Ashes of the Singularity CPU test, where Skylake-X is 8% down compared to its predecessors, both of which hand in much the same result. In fact, the old chips even beat the 10-core i9 by 3%. The margin is smaller on Far Cry Primal, but basically Broadwell beats Haswell by a couple of frames per second, but that in turn beats Skylake-X by a couple of FPS. And meanwhile, The Witcher 3, there's no difference at all between the 3 processor architectures. But it has to be said that Skylake-X gets its licks in too. In the AC Unity test, there's a small boost for the 7820X, while the old 5960X, the CPU I use in my PC every day, well, that manages to beat its Broadwell-E replacement by a whisker. There's more good news for Skylake-X. Crysis 3 inches ahead of its predecessors and does the same thing in the division. I mean, 2 to 3 frames per second isn't going to change the world, but when the headlines are talking about a regression in performance on Skylake-X, even the small wins are worth mentioning. Rise of the Tomb Raider? Yeah, that's another one that sees a Skylake-X boost, about 6% there. But I think the real takeaway here is that the last few generations of enthusiast many-core chips, well, let's face it, they're all holding their own. Personally, I think it's probably down to the shift to DDR4 and the extra bandwidth available there. Oh yes, I am going to bore you now once again about the importance of decent memory. The 7820X, man, it's an overclocking monster. 4.8 GHz on all 8 cores and 16 threads, and that's nice. But let's compare the Witcher 3 performance at stock clocks with 3200 MHz RAM compared to 4.8 GHz performance at bargain basement 2133 MHz speeds. Yes, the stock chip is faster. Combine the overclock with faster memory And yes, that's when you get the true benefit. And it's worth pointing out here that I'm using 3200 MHz RAM, the same stuff I benched Haswell-E and Broadwell-E with to ensure parity in benchmarking results. I've seen reports of users taking Skylake-X RAM up to 4 GHz and beyond, so yeah, I'm kind of curious to see what benefit that brings. But yeah, 8-core comparisons. So what about Ryzen from AMD? I went back to those 4.4 GHz head-to-heads and factored in the 1800X at 4 GHz. And remember that you stand a really good chance of getting a $330 1700 to hit the same performance level. So how does that work? Well, there are obviously titles that are a lot slower, no doubt about it. Far Cry Primal's love of single-core power is a case in point here. It saw the 7740X quad cruise to victory against its many-core siblings, but they're holding their own quite nicely here against the AMD offering. But you know, 15 frames per second off the pace at that price isn't disastrous. The Witcher 3, yeah, about 25 frames per second under par here, but you know, it's still averaging 121 FPS with a 99 frames per second minimum. The Division, 6 frames per second slower, but you know, undistinguishable really during gameplay. Crysis 3, it's about 20 to 30 FPS slower, but once again, we're still looking at an average of 144 FPS. The weakness here is in the minimum, 55 FPS versus minimums in the 80 on Intel. You can feel the difference definitely, but here's the thing. An overclocked Ryzen 1700 is $330, and that's up against $600 for the 7820X. And let's not forget that Intel was asking for a cool grand for its older gen octo-core enthusiast chips. Now, of course, the Intel chips have a key advantage. You can't really overclock a Ryzen processor much beyond 4 GHz. Meanwhile, Skylake-X, well, it's insane. I didn't have much joy with the 6-core chip, funnily enough, though. 4.4, 4.5 GHz, that was kind of the limit of my sample, but the 8-core 7820X managed 4.8 GHz, while the 10-core i9, 4.6 GHz. Oh yeah, and a shout out to the quad-core 7740X. 5 GHz on 1.3 volts if you have the cooling to handle that. The key issue is power consumption, heat, and ensuring your board can handle the power. Put it this way, once you start to overclock, efficiency goes completely out of the window. An all-in-one liquid cooler solution is required as a minimum, and I'd actually recommend a tri-fan radiator. The Corsair H110i GT I used did the job, but yet it's loud. 70 to 80 degrees on my processors though, the heat was contained adequately. Just ensure that your motherboard has an 8+4 pin power input like the MSI Gaming M7 here, and look into ensuring that the VRMs can handle the amount of power you're going to put through them. I'd recommend keeping voltage in the 1.2 to 1.25 volt area, because beyond that, things get toasty and indeed scary. Beyond 4.4 GHz, well, don't expect any game-changing improvement to frame rates, but do expect even more insane power draw and heat generation. So, overall, what is the takeaway here? Well, I guess the good news is that prices are falling. Intel's 8-core chips did indeed used to cost $1,000. 7820X is now $600, and the 10-core variant takes its place at the top of the stack. But here's the thing, the arrival of Ryzen and its upcoming 16-core Threadripper really puts the pressure on. Meanwhile, at the other end of the stack, Ryzen 7 and the quad-core i7s cause profound issues for the 6 and 8-core chips in terms of value. Yes, Intel's 7800X and 7820X are better, but are they that much better? And at the same time, this platform kind of feels rough around the edges and sort of unfinished. And while the clocks are generally higher, the power consumption is often eye-opening. Overclocking is pretty stunning, it has to be said. I mean, 4.8 GHz, 8 cores, 16 threads, that's amazing. But with talk of overheating VRMs, are the boards actually ready for that kind of overclocking throughput? I do have to wonder. Now, traditionally, Intel has been virtually bulletproof, but the X299 platform clearly isn't. I mean, could it be that for the first time in years, Intel is actually starting to squirm here? Was this platform rushed to market? Food for thought, right? I think it's pretty clear that 6 and 8 core chips can offer advantage, possibly more so in future, but man, my 5960X is several years old now, and the 7820X isn't exactly showing a huge improvement in gaming. In fact, in some respects, my old chip is better clock for clock. My advice, I kind of think that the 6-core 7800X is probably the best bet in terms of price versus performance, but personally I'd wait to see the platform settle down before spending a ton of cash on an X299 system. Right then, well, I'm going to leave things there. As always, do like and subscribe to support this kind of work. It's not exactly trivial to amass this kind of data. It takes time and effort, and we appreciate your support. Oh yeah, and remember to follow us on Twitter. But for now, from me, thanks for watching.